Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. This video we're going to talk about duty holsters for comped handguns. When it comes to duty holsters, you really don't have a whole lot of choices. If you have an honest-to-God need for a retention, be it level 2, level 3 holster for law enforcement or security duty, your options are kind of limited. I mean, Safariland's been rocking that monocle pretty hard with their monopoly on duty holsters, and that's okay because they make a really good holster. I've always been apprehensive to use an aftermarket Kydex bender duty holster for actual police, law enforcement, or security duty, just because Safariland has such a venerable reputation of saving lives and keeping guns out of the hands of bad guys because their holsters work. But when it comes to optic mounting and the smaller category now of putting a comp on a duty handgun, your holster options have been severely limited. And I found in my experience that if I want to use a Safariland, I have to modify it. Now, I was blessed in my last 2 years of law enforcement, uniform law enforcement. I was able to carry a comped handgun with an optic on duty for the last 2 years that I was in the uniform. But I had to modify my holster. Now, there's two holsters. There used to be one, now there's two from Safariland, two categories, I guess, models. The 6354DO is the venerable. It's been around the longest. It was the first holster I got, and is the one I spent most of my time with for duty use. Originally, I just carried a Glock 17 with a Surefire, and I had an RMR on it. And when I got into comps, and I found comps would run reliably with my chosen self-defense ammunition, my duty ammunition that I was authorized to use, I decided to throw a comp on my gun and found that I had to modify my holster. So I modified my 6354DO using the comp and a heat gun. Just by working, I had to remove the light guard, or there's a couple different terms for it, and the barrel indexing plug that you find in the bottom of the majority of the light bearing Safariland holsters. I always take that plug out anyway because I don't like the fact that brass and stuff can get caught in there, or any kind of debris from media from training purposes. If I've got a shooter to my right, he could be putting brass right into my holster. So I would always take that plug out because I just didn't want it. I also wanted water and anything else that would get in the holster to just drain clear out of there. And I didn't find a significant need as far as retention was concerned for that barrel indexing plug. That's got to come out too, obviously, because I'm going to a comp length gun. Once I've done that, I just put I use a heat gun, and I heat up the end of the holster, and I put the comp in there, and I kind of work it around just a little bit, pull the gun out, let it cool, check my holster, check my draw strokes, not just from a standing position, but also from, laying on my back, sitting down, things like that, to make sure it doesn't bind in any physical position I could find myself in. And that's been my technique from that very first holster I modified. In fact, the one you're seeing, this OD Green 6354DO, it's the oldest DO model holster I have. Now, the DO model holster is great because it's an ALS, and even though it was originally intended for the Dr. Optic DO, it works with RMRs, it works with pretty much any pistol optic you're likely to see on duty. Not too long ago, Safariland came out with a new purpose-built RDS holster, the RDS line, which is available in a couple of different configurations. Now, I run two different duty holsters these days. I have one that's just a general instructional rig. I use a Blue Alpha Gear soft duty belt, the inner and the outer belt that Blue Alpha Gear offers, which I found to be really, really awesome for that purposes. If I'm teaching a law enforcement class or something where I want an exposed retention level holster. And if you haven't noticed this about me, if I'm carrying a handgun exposed to the world, it's in a retention holster. I'm not a big fan, even on running plate carriers or anything like that. If I'm running a rifle as a primary weapon, I feel like the retention of the holster is even more important, because the handgun isn't my primary weapon, so I'm not necessarily thought on it all the time. I want to make sure my handgun is secure from greedy little fingers and greedy little bushes and vines and anything else I might come in contact with, depending on what I'm doing. But the RDS holster, same story. Had to modify it in the exact same way. I bought a 34 length, hoping that with the shorter comps that I was using at the time, it would be able to holster efficiently. And it would, but it would bind on the gun really, really bad, to the point where I wasn't comfortable with it. So I modified it in the exact same way. I heated up the end of the holster with a heat gun, lightly. I didn't want to go full bore with it, just using the minimum amount of heat I needed to create the modification. Stuck the comp in the end of it, worked it around a little bit, let it cool, checked my draw stroke from all those various positions, and got it to a point where I was comfortable with it. Now, these days, I'm using two different guns, comp length anyway. The agency arms comps are the ones I'm showing in the video. I've got the single chamber and the double chamber. The single chamber brings the gun just past the length of a Glock 34. The double chamber brings the gun further past the length of a Glock 34, but I'm able to holster either of those comp lengths, comp styles, in either holster. And that's just something that you definitely want, especially if you have varied comp lengths. Now, the agency comps do tend to follow the lines of the Glock handgun a little better than some of the other comps that are out there. That being said, both of these holsters also work with like the Texas Black Rifle Co., Stubby, and Micro comp. Those are the comps that I have. I haven't tried any other comps in them, and if there was another comp that I was going to use, as long as it didn't stick out too far from the basic geometry of the firearm, which I don't know of any that really do. I know a KKM's work in these holsters because I've had a student run my gear with his KKM comp on a 17, and another student at some point ran a KKM on a 19 in my holsters, and they worked fine. So that's pretty much the secret when it comes to the belts. Now, for my RDS rig, that belt's set up more for plate carrier purposes, for direct action, if you want to call it that, purposes. That's the same belt system I used when I would ever do a call out. I'd have to put on my cool guy kit. I like the RDS holster. I was glad it exists. I'm glad that they have a purpose-built system for it. But that being said, I don't really see a predominant reason to depart from the 6354. It's a really good holster if it fits your optic, if it fits your handgun, if it fits the weapon light and the comp, if you're going to comp, that you're going to use. So I'm glad the RDS exists. The little shroud that you can use to protect your emitter in inclement weather for duty carry is helpful. Although I do see these holsters come through RDS classes. Predominantly, this is the most popular holster I'm seeing right now when I'm teaching RDS LE classes. And I see those hoods go down range occasionally because of the draw stroke or something catches or something like that. So some people are literally foregoing that hood now, and they're just tearing it off and throwing it in a drawer, because it is removable pretty easily to remove. Actually, you don't need tools or anything. But I've had enough questions about how I set up my duty holsters for comped handguns that I wanted to put this video out there. I'm not going to get into the whole argument of, oh, why would you comp a 9mm? I don't like recoil, and you shouldn't either. So if I can do something that will reliably allow me to remove recoil from my handgun, why in the hell wouldn't I do it? But that's an argument for a different time, and most likely to take place on the internet, where no one's going to change anyone's mind. But I wanted to make this video specific to those holster types because I had enough questions about, hey, how'd you modify your holsters to work with comps? And I want to put it out there. Of course, the caveat to this is, am I reducing the durability or the retention level of the holster? In my experience, no. Now, whenever I would do weapon retention training, I would use a separate holster, not my duty holster, because my personal feeling is one really strong attempt for someone to take your gun away from your duty holster, even if the holster doesn't break, you probably should replace it. If someone legitimately tries to take your firearm from you and the holster does its job, I feel like that holster has served its purpose and paid for itself, and I don't know of what kind of structural damage has occurred to the internal locking mechanisms that are not visible to the naked eye. So at that point, I'm going to get rid of the holster and replace it anyway. So anytime I would do retention training, I would use an identical 6354 DO. And my training holsters have been broken numerous times. And they were modified in the exact same way so I could still use them for training and practice. So I can't say that I saw a significant enough reduction in the rigidity or the structural integrity of the holster by modifying it to accept the comp that I wouldn't do it. Because if I found that, then I probably would take the comp off my gun and realize that, like, hey, until somebody purpose builds a duty holster for this, I just can't trust it. But that wasn't the experience that I had. Of course, your experiences may be different, but again, if you're really, really wrestling around on that holster and tugging on that gun, you might be compounding the structural damage and reducing the structural integrity of the holster to a point where if somebody really does try to take your gun, they might get it. So that's just something to think about with your holster. I consider holsters to be perishable items. And that's just my feeling on the subject, and I'm sure if you talk to Sfarland, they might agree with me. I'm Eric Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.